I was having one of those perfect mornings on my ranch, the kind where the sun peeks over the horizon, painting everything gold. The cows are lazily chewing their cud, and the wind carries just the right amount of freedom with it. I had my coffee in hand, sitting on the porch thinking life couldn't get any better. The air smelled of fresh hay, damp earth, and a hint of mischief. That mischief I didn't realize would soon be human-shaped and armed with a clipboard. That's when Karen appeared. She didn't just stroll up the driveway like a normal neighbor. No, she practically announced herself with a stomp that echoed across my fields. Her sunglasses were too big, her hair too perfect, and her expression was the kind that suggested she had personally appointed herself sheriff of the entire county. She held a clipboard like it was a weapon of mass destruction. And I swear, the minute she stepped out of her car, she started scanning the land like she was ready to declare war on any blade of grass that dared to grow over her imaginary line. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep it casual. Karen didn't respond with a greeting. She just squinted at my property, then at me, then back at the property again, as if she was performing some elaborate inspection ritual that only she understood. "You're encroaching," she finally said, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning quiet. "This land is in violation of standards." I blinked. Encroaching. Standards? On my own land. I tried to hide my smirk because the situation was already ridiculous. Here she was, standing on my ranch, wielding a clipboard like a scepter, talking about rules that, as far as I knew, she had personally invented in her head sometime last week. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone friendly but skeptical. "This is my property." Her eyes narrowed. "You know exactly what I mean. You're over the line. I suggest you take immediate action." At that moment, I considered asking if she'd like me to bring out a tape measure and a compass so we could solve this like civilized humans. Then I imagined her response. Outrage, of course, and probably a dramatic letter to the board detailing my egregious offenses. I laughed quietly to myself, because I could already see how absurd this was going to get. But the laughter was premature. Very, very premature. The next morning, I stepped outside, expecting maybe a strongly worded note on my door or perhaps a passive-aggressive ribbon marking some imaginary boundary. Instead, my jaw dropped. There it was. A fence. Not a small decorative fence or a harmless line of posts. A full-blown, massive eyesore of a fence had appeared overnight. It cut across my pastures, blocked my driveway, and had even a few of my cows in what seemed like a test of their patience. I just stood there, coffee forgotten, trying to comprehend the audacity. Did this really happen? I muttered to myself. It was as if someone had whispered, "Let's make your life a living soap opera," and Karen had been the eager actor ready to perform. I walked along the fence, inspecting it as if maybe, just maybe, it was a dream and I could wake up at any moment. The construction was suspiciously neat, as if done by someone who had nothing better to do than obsess over every inch of land she didn't own. The thought of her meticulously measuring, hammering posts, and plotting this entire ordeal made me both laugh and grit my teeth. I called the office. I emailed. I tried waving from across the fence. Nothing. It was like speaking into a void, a bureaucratic black hole that swallowed complaints whole and spat out nothing but frustration. The absurdity of it all started to gnaw at me. Someone had built a literal wall on my property, and the people responsible acted as if it was perfectly reasonable. As I paced my ranch, the cows watching me like I had lost my mind, I began to wonder how this had escalated so quickly. 1 minute life was simple. The next, my peaceful ranch had become of rules, regulations, and Karen's unwavering self-confidence. I realized then that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was a full-blown fiasco waiting to unfold, and I had a feeling it was going to be both hilarious and infuriating in equal measure. Little did I know, the fence was only the beginning. Karen had no idea that the person she was trying to intimidate was about to hold all the power in this ridiculous little game. All she knew was that she was right, the fence was perfect, and she was queen. I, on the other hand, was about to discover something that would turn this entire drama upside down, and that discovery would make Karen's perfect fence feel like a small, meaningless detail in a much larger story. And that, my friends, is when the real fun began. The morning after discovering Karen's fence, I felt a strange mix of disbelief and fury. My driveway was half blocked, my pasture was sliced in two, and a few cows were giving me the stink eye like it was my fault they were trapped. I walked along the fence, tapping posts and muttering under my breath. "Who builds a fence like this overnight?" I asked no one in particular. The answer was obvious. Karen. Only Karen could turn a calm ranch into a fortress in a single night. I decided to try diplomacy. I waved to her from across the fence, smiling as innocently as possible. She didn't wave back. She didn't even blink. She was in full enforcement mode, clipboard raised like a shield, measuring tape dangling like a sword. It was as if she was surveying her kingdom and I was the intruder daring to exist on her newly conquered land. Emails, phone calls, letters, I tried every civilized approach. Nothing worked. They acted like my complaints had been swallowed by a black hole. Each response I received was more absurd than the last. One email claimed the fence was completely within compliance and politely suggested I reconsider my position. Reconsider my position. On my own property. I laughed out loud, which startled the cows. They mooed as if agreeing or maybe judging me. As the days passed, I began to examine the fence more closely. It was ridiculously precise, every post perfectly aligned, every section perfectly straight. Karen had gone full obsessive mode. The craftsmanship was impressive if you ignored the fact that it blocked my tractor and chopped my pasture in half. I joked to myself that the cows were probably planning a rebellion. Maybe they would sneak under the fence while Karen wasn't watching. Curiosity got the better of me. I started digging through the old permits and county records. I pretended to be just a concerned rancher checking on boundaries. The documents were dry, full of legal jargon and measurements, but something about them felt familiar. I flipped through more papers, my brow furrowing until I saw it. My signature. Not just any signature, but my actual signature from years ago, approving the exact lines Karen was now fencing off. I blinked, stunned. I laughed nervously because the situation was almost too perfect. Karen had built a massive fence thinking she was enforcing the rules, unaware that the rules she clung to had been signed by me. The county surveyor, the person with the ultimate authority on these lines. My mind raced. Could it really be this simple? Had Karen unknowingly fenced herself onto my land with my own approval? The suspense of the situation hit me in waves. I paced my ranch, imagining her reaction if she ever found out. I pictured the horror on her face, the frantic flipping through her own papers, the desperate calls to the board. It was like a movie playing in slow motion, and I was both the audience and the lead actor. I could barely contain my grin. The power dynamic had shifted in a way Karen could never predict. But I didn't want to reveal it just yet. Not immediately. There was a thrill in the suspense, a delicious tension in letting her continue believing she was in control. Each day, I watched her patrol the fence, measuring, checking, fuming. She had no idea that the very person whose signature she worshipped as proof of her authority was standing right there, calmly sipping coffee, planning her eventual undoing. I also began to notice the absurdity of it all in a more comedic light. The cows had learned to jump small sections of the fence, sneaking past her defenses when she wasn't looking. One particularly clever cow seemed to stare at me every morning as if sharing a secret joke. The drama of Karen's obsession collided with the comedy of my increasingly adventurous livestock, and I realized this story was going to be one for the ages. I started documenting everything, not with the intention of confrontation, but to savor the chaos. Photos, measurements, little notes about Karen's antics. Each day added suspense because who knew what she would do next? The unpredictability of her next move kept me on edge and kept me laughing at the same time. I was part detective, part strategist, and part audience to a real-life comedy of errors. And through it all, one thought kept running through my mind. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. She had built her fence, enforced her rules, and strutted around like she owned the place, unaware that the person with the ultimate authority on property lines, the county surveyor who had approved every inch of that land, was quietly waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And when that moment came, the suspense, the drama, and the comedy would collide in a way neither of us would ever forget. But that moment wasn't here yet. For now, Karen had her fence. The cows had their rebellion, and I had a secret smile, knowing the best part of this story was still waiting to unfold. After a few days of silently observing Karen and her fence, I knew it was time to dig deeper. The absurdity of the situation had shifted into a kind of suspenseful obsession for me. I started pulling county records, old permits, and survey maps from years past, pretending I was just an inquisitive neighbor who liked paperwork. Little did anyone know, I had a personal connection to every line, every measurement, and every signature. The thrill of it made my morning coffee taste a little. As I flipped through the stack of yellowed papers, I noticed the meticulous details of each survey. Bearings, distances, markers carefully noted along property lines. My brow furrowed, then lifted in disbelief. The handwriting, the notes, the neat signatures at the bottom, it was unmistakably mine. Slowly, realization began to creep in like a suspenseful fog. This was not just coincidence. I had signed these permits years ago. I was the county surveyor who approved the exact layout that Karen was now fencing off as her supposed authority. I leaned back in my chair, heart racing with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Could it really be that simple? Had Karen, in her overzealous obsession with rules, built a massive fence thinking she was asserting power, completely unaware that the ultimate authority rested in the hands of the very person she was trying to intimidate? It was almost too perfect, like a plot twist straight out of a movie, and I could feel the suspense building in my chest. The possibilities ran through my mind like a fast-moving. I could confront her immediately, reveal the truth, watch her scramble in panic. Or I could play it slow, let her continue believing she was in control, savoring every dramatic gesture she made as she measured and measured again, thinking she was untouchable. The strategist in me leaned heavily toward patience. Suspense, after all, is sweetest when drawn out. Each morning, I watched Karen patrol the fence like a queen inspecting her kingdom. She measured posts, jotted notes, and even had a little ruler tucked behind her ear at one point. I could barely keep a straight face. Every gesture, every hiss of frustration added to the comedy and tension of the situation. Meanwhile, the cows seemed to sense the absurdity, too. One clever little calf managed to slip under a small gap near the edge of the fence, looking back at me as if to say, "See, chaos is fun." I documented everything. Photos, videos, notes, small sketches of her patrol route. Each detail added to my growing arsenal of suspense. Karen had no idea that the person she thought she was enforcing rules against had already approved every inch of her precious fence. She didn't know that she was walking into a trap of irony and legal authority, so perfect it could make a lawyer laugh out loud. And then a thought hit me that made the suspense spike even higher. If I revealed my identity too soon, the story would end. Karen would back down, the fence would be corrected, and the drama would vanish. But if I waited, watched her fumble, let her overplay her hand, the eventual reveal would be spectacular. Neighbors would gasp, the board would scramble, and Karen would experience the kind of disbelief that only comes when someone realizes their entire sense of power was based on a misunderstanding. The more I observed, the more absurd it became. One afternoon, I saw her packing back and forth along the fence, muttering about illegal encroachments and penalties. The suspense was almost unbearable. I half expected her to call a lawyer on herself at that moment. I could hardly contain my laughter, but I knew patience was key. Each day, each measurement, each frustrated sigh was a string tightening the tension, setting the stage for the perfect reveal. Even the cows seemed to be in on it. They wandered freely, finding small openings, grazing close to the fence in a subtle form of protest. It was as if the entire ranch had become an accomplice in the suspenseful drama, playing along while Karen unknowingly built her own undoing. I spent hours imagining the reveal, the moment when I would calmly mention that I had signed the permits, that I was the county surveyor. The suspense, the drama, the comedy, it would all come crashing together in perfect timing. Karen would panic, the board would gasp, and the ranch would reclaim its peaceful rhythm. Until then, I had to continue the act, a silent observer with a secret that could topple the queen of the... And as the sun set over the ranch that evening, I sipped my coffee, looked at the fence, and smiled. Karen had no idea. The suspense was mine to control, and every day she patrolled, measured, and fumed added a new layer of tension. The story was far from over. In fact, the best part was still ahead. After days of watching Karen patrol the fence, measuring every post, jotting notes in her sacred little notebook, and muttering about rules I hadn't even remembered existed, I realized it was time to face her. Not with rage, not with threats, but with calm, measured confrontation. The kind that keeps suspense simmering while the other person has no idea what's coming. I approached her one morning, coffee in hand, trying to look like a casual neighbor who had just wandered over for a friendly chat. She noticed me immediately, clipboard snapping shut like a trap. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, eyes narrowing so sharply I half expected sparks to fly. "Just checking on my property," I said lightly, smiling. "Thought I'd see how the fence is holding up." Her jaw tightened. "This fence is perfectly legal. The has it. You are in violation if you do anything to change it." She waved her clipboard like a sword, pointing at every post as if they were little soldiers defending her honor. I held back a laugh. The suspense in her voice, the confidence she carried like a badge of authority, it was all part of the performance I had been waiting for. Every word she spat, every dramatic gesture, built the tension like a masterful scene in a movie, and she had no idea she was playing her role to perfection. I decided to play along, at least for now. "Oh, I see," I said innocently. "Well, I wouldn't want to cause trouble. Maybe we can review the property lines together." Her eyes flickered suspiciously, but she nodded, ready to prove her dominance. "That's unnecessary. Everything is documented. Everything is correct. The board will enforce it if needed." She tapped her clipboard for emphasis, as if that sound alone could summon the entire bureaucracy to her side. And then the suspense truly began. As we walked along the fence, I asked casual questions about the permits, the approvals, the measurements. Karen launched into a dramatic explanation of how the fence was entirely within her rights, citing rules I didn't even remember existed, reciting them like a lawyer defending a high-profile case. The suspense was killing me inside because I knew the truth. I was the county surveyor who had signed the permits. The authority she leaned on for power had come from me, and she had no clue. The more she talked, the more absurd the scene became. Neighbors peeked over fences, some whispering, some trying not to laugh. The cows wandered nearby, watching the drama unfold as if they understood it better than Karen did. She stomped, waved, and pointed, and I just nodded, pretending to listen intently, suppressing a grin that threatened to give everything away. At one point, she turned to me with a triumphant look like she had spotted a weakness. "You can't ignore this. The enforces these rules, and anyone who challenges them will face consequences." She leaned in, eyes fierce. The suspense hung in the air, thick and almost tangible. I had to make my next move carefully. One wrong word and the moment would be ruined. I decided to drop a subtle hint, nothing too direct. "Well, I suppose paperwork is important," I said slowly, casually flipping through a folder I had brought. "It can be tricky, keeping track of every line and signature over the years." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, but she quickly masked it with confidence. "Exactly, and that's why the enforces it so strictly. No one can challenge this." She smiled smugly, clearly thinking she had the upper hand. The suspense was unbearable. Inside, I was nearly bouncing with excitement. She had no idea that every rule she relied on, every permit she waved like a weapon, had my signature on it. The irony was perfect. The dramatic tension was reaching a peak, and the next revelation, when it came, would shatter her world entirely. We finished walking the fence line, her confidence unwavering, her sense of control total. She left thinking she had successfully lectured and intimidated me. I, on the other hand, was quietly savoring the knowledge that the real confrontation hadn't even begun. The suspense wasn't just in her actions. It was in the fact that she didn't even realize the ground was shifting beneath her feet. And as she drove away, muttering about fines, violations, and meetings, I leaned against my own fence, coffee in hand, grinning. The confrontation had begun, yes, but the reveal, the part where Karen's perfect little world would crumble, was still coming. And when it did, it would be everything, dramatic, chaotic, and completely satisfying. The stage was set, the tension high, and the suspense just unbearable enough to make the next act unforgettable. After the confrontation, I knew that the next phase had to be subtle. Karen believed she had the upper hand, but in reality, she had no idea that the very person whose signature validated every inch of that fence was right in front of her. I decided to become a quiet observer, a patient strategist, letting the suspense build while she continued her little patrols and measurements. Every day was a performance, and I was both the director and the audience. I started scheming in plain sight. Every morning, I would walk past the fence casually, carrying my coffee, nodding at her like a friendly neighbor. She would straighten up immediately, clipboard ready, muttering rules under her breath, convinced she was enforcing order. Meanwhile, I was silently planning. The suspense was delicious, knowing she had no clue what was coming. The cows became my unexpected allies. One particularly clever one discovered a small gap near the edge of the fence and began slipping through at will, returning each time like it had just pulled off the perfect heist. I couldn't help but laugh every time it happened. It was almost like the ranch itself was conspiring with me, turning Karen's obsession with order into a comedy of errors. I also started subtly adjusting survey markers, just a few inches here and there, under the guise of checking alignment. Karen would rush over to measure, tape in hand, and I would watch her fume silently, never giving away the secret that I was the one who had approved the original lines. The suspense was mounting, each small movement adding tension, each glance exchanged between us like a silent battle of wills. Neighbors began noticing the chaos, whispering about the mysterious events at the fence. Some thought I had lost my mind, others suspected a feud, and a few had no idea what was going on at all. This only added to the suspense because the more people observed, the more dramatic the situation became. Karen, of course, remained oblivious to the fact that the entire drama was built on her own misunderstanding and my quiet control. Every day, I imagined the moment of revelation. I pictured Karen's face when she realized that her precious fence, every post, every measurement, every citation of rules she had memorized like scripture, had been approved by me, the county surveyor. The suspense of imagining her shock kept me energized, fueled my strategy, and made each mundane morning on the ranch feel like a build-up to a climactic scene in a movie. The tension grew as Karen tried to make adjustments to the fence, adding extra posts or measuring twice for good measure. She was so confident, so sure that her rules and authority were absolute, that she didn't notice how perfectly the situation was aligning against her. Each action she took to strengthen her control only built suspense, because I knew the reveal would be inevitable and it would be spectacular. I also started documenting everything meticulously: photos, videos, notes, sketches of the fence line and Karen's patrol patterns. Not because I needed evidence, but because it made the suspense. Each photo was a silent reminder of the power she didn't realize I held, and each note was a testament to how perfectly absurd this situation had become. The suspense was compounded by small, almost humorous interruptions. A curious neighbor's dog wandered into the pasture and set off a minor chase, startling Karen mid-measurement. A sudden gust of wind knocked over her clipboard once, and she nearly had a meltdown, muttering about professional standards and irreparable damage. Each of these moments heightened the tension while adding a subtle layer of comedy to the drama. As days turned into a week, I could see Karen's frustration growing. She was becoming more meticulous, more obsessive, more convinced that she was in control. All the while, I continued my patient act, letting her believe she was the orchestrator of this saga. The suspense was at its peak. Every glance, every measurement, every muttered threat from Karen made the eventual reveal feel imminent. And through it all, I reminded myself to stay calm, to savor each moment. The best part of suspense, I realized, is patience. The longer she believed she was winning, the greater the impact when the truth finally came out. Karen was unknowingly building her own dramatic downfall, and the stage was perfectly set for the moment when I would finally reveal my identity, the truth behind the permits, and the ultimate irony of her obsession. By the end of each day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cows grazed freely, I would take a deep breath, smile quietly to myself, and sip my coffee. The suspense had become almost intoxicating, and I knew that the best, most dramatic, most satisfying part of this story was still waiting to unfold. Karen had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The day finally came when I knew it was time to reveal at least part of the truth. Karen had been patrolling the fence like a queen defending her kingdom for over a week, completely unaware that the person she thought she was intimidating held ultimate authority over the entire property. The suspense was thick in the air, almost tangible, like electricity before a storm. I watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, pretending to casually inspect my land. She was measuring, marking, muttering about easements and violations, completely absorbed in her mission. I decided to walk over, slow and deliberate, letting her sense my presence. She straightened immediately, clipboard ready, eyes narrowing so sharply I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. She thought she was in control. She had no idea what was about to hit her. "Good morning," I said casually, strolling toward her like nothing unusual was happening. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, voice sharp, the kind that commands attention even from disinterested cows. "This fence is perfectly legal. You can't just wander onto property." I smiled lightly, enjoying the suspense. "Oh, I'm not here to wander," I said, flipping open a folder I had brought along. "I just thought I'd check on some of the permits for the fence." Her eyes flickered. A small hesitation, just a fraction of a second, but I noticed it. The suspense built. She tried to mask it with confidence, waving her clipboard like a shield. "That has everything," she said. "All lines, all rules, all procedures have been followed. There's nothing more to discuss." "Of course," I said, nodding slowly, letting the tension simmer. "But paperwork can be tricky. Sometimes things slip through the cracks or signatures get misplaced. It's always worth a second look." His fingers tightened around the edge of the clipboard. She was starting to sense, perhaps, that something was off. The suspense was reaching its peak. Neighbors had begun gathering quietly at the edges of their properties, whispering, peeking, drawn by the drama. Even the cows seemed to sense the tension, standing still as if waiting for a cue. And then I dropped it, subtly at first. "You know," I said casually, "I actually signed these permits years ago. I'm the county surveyor who approved this fence." Time seemed to slow. Karen froze mid-gesture, clipboard halfway to her chest. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She turned pale, muttered something that sounded like a cross between shock and disbelief, and the clipboard fell from her hands with a loud thud that echoed across the pasture. The neighbors gasped, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen's confidence crumbled instantly, replaced by a mix of horror, anger, and embarrassment. She had built her kingdom, enforced her rules, and strutted around like a ruler, never realizing that the ultimate authority, the very person whose signature validated every line, was standing right there, quietly sipping coffee, smiling. What do you mean?" she stammered, taking a step back. Her face was red, a mix of fury and humiliation. You can't, that's impossible." "It's true," I said calmly, letting the suspense stretch, savoring each moment of her disbelief. "Every permit, every measurement you relied on, every rule you thought supported you came from me." Her knees wobbled slightly. The clipboard was forgotten, lying in the grass. She looked around desperately, as if searching for some way to regain control, some loophole, some imagined authority. The suspense was almost unbearable, the tension at a breaking point. Every dramatic beat had been set up perfectly, every moment of her smugness paid off in this one revelation. The cows mooed as if applauding. Neighbors were silent but wide-eyed, witnessing the perfect irony unfold. Karen tried to speak, but words failed her. She had been so confident, so sure, and now the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. The drama, the comedy, the suspense, it all collided in one perfect, chaotic moment. I smiled, letting the silence linger, enjoying the crescendo. The suspense had reached its peak. Karen had no idea how completely her world had shifted, how the power she thought she wielded was just an illusion. The ranch, the fence, the permits, it was all mine, legally and perfectly, and she had unknowingly built her own downfall. As she finally muttered something about consulting the board, I leaned back against my own fence, sipping my coffee. The reveal had happened, but the aftermath, the chaos, the fallout, it was far from over. The suspense would continue to ripple through the neighborhood, and Karen would have to face the consequences of building her perfect little fence on the wrong side of reality. And as I watched her storm away, muttering, I knew one thing for certain. The best part of this story, the humor, the drama, and the sweet satisfaction, was just beginning. After the revelation, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would slink away quietly, humiliated but defeated. That, of course, was wishful thinking. Karen was not built for quiet acceptance. The very next morning, she was back, clipboard in hand, looking like a general preparing for battle. The suspense returned immediately. I knew the wasn't going to let this slide quietly, and Karen, bless her, was determined to escalate everything. Her first move was predictable but still absurd. She started drafting new rules in her little notebook, muttering about loopholes and emergency amendments. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, trying not to laugh as she carefully outlined penalties that would make a bureaucrat blush. She was so consumed with proving she was right that she didn't notice how ironic the whole situation had become. The suspense was electric. Every scribble, every muttered rule was building tension that made the story even more delicious. Next came the phone calls. Karen was dialing lawyers, the board, anyone she could think of who might reinforce her authority. She paced like a caged lion, clipboard tucked under one arm, phone pressed against her ear with one hand, waving the other dramatically as she spoke. The neighbors were now fully invested, peeking over fences, whispering, and occasionally laughing quietly when Karen flailed about. The suspense wasn't just mine anymore, it had spread to the entire street. Then came the threats of fines. "If these violations aren't corrected immediately," she barked at no one in particular, "you will be penalized according to regulations." I couldn't help but shake my head. It was both hilarious and surreal. Here she was, threatening penalties on someone who literally held the authority to sign every line of that fence. The dramatic irony was so perfect it almost hurt. I decided to let the chaos continue, observing quietly, documenting every action. Karen's frustration was growing by the hour, her confidence slipping faster than she could realize. She tried measuring the fence again, adding extra posts, checking stakes repeatedly, as if more obsessiveness could somehow rewrite reality. The suspense built with every meticulous action she took. She had no idea that the person she thought she was fighting against had the ultimate say. Even the cows seemed to sense the absurdity of it all. One wandered right up to Karen mid-measurement and gave a loud moo, as if scolding her for taking herself too seriously. She jumped back, muttering about aggressive animals, completely missing the comedic timing of the moment. I watched and chuckled quietly. It was like the ranch itself was mocking her, playing along with the suspenseful drama I had orchestrated without her knowing. The neighbors' involvement added another layer. Some came by to watch, offering subtle comments and exaggerated gasps at Karen's antics. It was suspense and comedy rolled into one live performance. Karen, oblivious to the humor, continued as if she were on a high-stakes mission, never realizing the absurdity of her actions. Each step she took, each frantic call she made, only heightened the tension and anticipation for the inevitable outcome. Finally, it became clear that the board was caught in the chaos too. They tried to mediate, sending emails and notices, but nothing worked. Karen's over-the-top dramatics and obsessive enforcement had created a perfect storm of confusion. They didn't understand the legal authority I held, and Karen's panic made everything worse. The suspense was almost unbearable, because at any moment, a new rule, a new threat, or a new dramatic gesture could tip the situation even further into chaos. By the end of the week, Karen was exhausted, frazzled, and yet still refusing to admit defeat. Her perfect little kingdom was crumbling around her, the fence she had so carefully built now a symbol of her misplaced confidence. The suspense had reached its peak, but I knew there was still one final act left. The resolution, the humorous aftermath, and the final lesson were all still waiting to unfold. As I sipped my coffee that evening, looking over the fence, the cows grazing peacefully and Karen muttering to herself in the distance, I realized something. Suspense isn't just about what happens. It's about what could happen, about tension, anticipation, and the slow unraveling of someone's misplaced sense of power. And in this case, the suspense was far from over. The final chapter was coming, and it would be dramatic, hilarious, and utterly satisfying. By the time the final showdown approached, Karen had exhausted every tactic she could think of. She tried new rules, new fines, phone calls, and frantic meetings with the board, but nothing worked. The suspense had been building for weeks, and now it was about to reach its ultimate conclusion. I watched quietly from my porch, coffee in hand, letting her burn herself out. It was almost too perfect to be real. She stomped across the ranch that morning, muttering about violations and encroachments, waving her clipboard like a sword. The cows watched her with mild curiosity, occasionally mooing in disapproval, and I realized they had become accomplices in this absurd little drama. Neighbors peeked over fences, whispering, some holding back laughter, others wide-eyed with anticipation. The The suspense was everywhere, almost tangible, as if the ranch itself held its breath for what was coming. I decided it was finally time to wrap things up. I walked over to Karen calmly, not a hint of urgency in my step, just enough casualness to keep her on edge. "Good morning," I said lightly, smiling. "I think it's time we settle this." She spun around, clipboard ready, eyes narrowed to slits. "Settle what? Everything is fine. The enforces the rules. You can't." "Actually," I interrupted, holding up the folder with the original permits, "everything is exactly as it should be. Every post, every line, every permit you've relied on, it was approved by me." The gasp that escaped her mouth was almost theatrical. Her clipboard slipped from her hands again, clattering to the ground. She turned pale, stumbled back a step, and looked around as if searching for a loophole, a secret ally, some imaginary escape hatch. The suspense was so thick I could almost taste it. What do you mean?" she stammered, voice trembling between fury and disbelief. You signed these." I nodded calmly. "Years ago, I'm the county surveyor, the authority you thought you had. It all comes from me." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Neighbors held their breath. The cows seemed to pause mid-chew. Karen's face went through every shade of red imaginable: anger, embarrassment, confusion, panic. The dramatic irony was complete. The suspense, finally released, was exhilarating. She tried to protest, tried to argue, tried to reclaim some shred of control, but it was pointless. Her kingdom of rules, fines, and obsessive measurements had collapsed. The fence she had so proudly built to enforce authority now stood as a monument to her own overconfidence. Neighbors whispered, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The ranch had returned to its natural rhythm, the drama finally resolved. As Karen retreated, muttering about contacting lawyers, rewriting rules, and consulting the board again, I took a deep breath and let the humor of the situation sink in. The suspense had been worth it. Every step, every measure, every furious gesture she had made now seemed almost comic in hindsight. It was absurd, ridiculous, and perfectly satisfying. I walked along the fence, inspecting it one last time. The cows wandered freely, grazing without a care, as if celebrating their reclaimed territory. The neighbors slowly returned to their routines, some whispering about the great fiasco, others still chuckling at the image of Karen flailing with her clipboard. The suspense had reached its peak, and now it had been released in waves of humor and drama that no one would forget. Reflecting on the whole ordeal, I realized a few things. Sometimes the people who try hardest to control others are the most blind to reality. Bureaucracy, rules, and obsession can create suspense and drama beyond imagination. And patience in observing, planning, and letting events unfold, can turn even the most absurd situation into a story worth remembering. As I sipped my coffee that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The fence was corrected, the ranch was peaceful, and Karen had learned the hard way that authority without understanding is meaningless. The suspense, humor, and drama had played out perfectly, and life on the ranch returned to its simple rhythm. And I couldn't resist one final thought, a wry smile tugging at my lips. Always check your surveyor. You might be living next to a Karen, or worse, signing her permits without even knowing it. The suspense of life, I realized, is always lurking somewhere, and sometimes patience and a little humor are the best ways to enjoy the show. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.